When the US entered the Great War, it was desperately short of machine guns. On top of that, they would change their official automatic in the 11th hour. But what could be so tantalizing of an invention that they would take this risk? Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a bunch of nothing, and that's because I could not bring today's gun home. But imagine that I have just laid out a beautiful 30 caliber machine gun model of 1917, also at that time known as the Browning heavy machine gun. And if you're unsure what that looks like, well, I got you covered. With an overall length of 37 1/2 inch and weighing in, without water or tripod, at 32.62 pounds, it's actually a fairly compact heavy machine gun. It of course chambers the 30-06 cartridge and takes a standard 250 round cloth belt. Alright gang, this is going to be an interesting set of episodes. I'm going to come out and say it right now. This portion, this first half, is all history. There's no shooting and there's no May at all, and that's because the 1917 is a big story that is deeply linked to the US perception and adoption of machine guns in the Great War. It's a lot to chew on, and so we've broken it up into two parts so that we can kind of cover both the gun and the attitude and problems around it. In addition, some footage is going to be of a 2017 vintage. We worked with this gun as part of a batch of episodes. That trip resulted in the BAR, the Russian Maxim, some of the Hotchkiss work, and the Pedersen device indirectly. For all that, I still owe Marty and the gang, especially Michael, you're my hero, some thanks. Thanks. Well, in all of that, we managed to access a pure 1917, and while we gave it a good once-over, we also thought we'd get another shot at doing some of the close-up work, maybe at a museum later on, and then it turns out that they are even more rare than we believed, so some of the footage today is going to be a little dated, but we'll muddle through that together. Now, let's get into the history of this particular firearm. This character has had the third most screen time on this show after myself and May. This is John Moses Browning, a man often considered the greatest gun designer in history. We've seen him work wonders plenty of times in the course of our show. Today, however, I'll remind you of his gas trap patent of 1892. Here, Browning had locked in on using the untapped potential energy of all that remaining pressure that is behind the bullet as it's thrown into flight. Now, it has been argued that Maxim made the first gas-powered operated machine gun and patent, but both he and Browning seem to have been working independently, and it's a minor point in our story today anyway. The important takeaway is that Browning was now working on auto-loading firearms and quickly adapted his design into what is now known as the apparatus. This weird-looking doohickey was a very early working machine gun running on a gas-operated piston, and one day we'll get to talk about it in more detail, just as soon as someone loans us a potato digger. That would be the nickname of this guy, a Browning-designed, Colt-produced machine gun, belt-fed and operated from a gas lever arm. And while still in use in World War I, it is not our topic today. And strangely, it isn't even really a major factor in our gun today. And this is where John Browning is really truly unique. Most of the inventors we see come up with like a good core idea, a sort of gun concept gestalt, and then it gets refined over and over, perfected into something not just usable, but field serviceable, or until the idea has been totally proven unworkable, that it can't be developed any further. A good example of this would be something like the Madsen light machine gun, which was a pretty funky and complicated machine that saw this sort of refinement made over decades that got into a functional weapon of war. Browning, however, he didn't stay married to his gas-operated concept. He didn't stay married to any of his concepts. Instead, he almost immediately starts experimenting in a totally different direction, recoil operation. Just about the time his 1895 was hitting the market, he's playing around with a whole new method. And I suppose in his mind, it was never wise to leave any stone unturned, or else the competition might get the worm. And so we see him experimenting with recoil operation, particularly pistols at first. These early patents would actually lead the way for the later Colt 1911, but that's another story entirely. In 1900, we also see him take on long arms that are using long recoil operation, a shotgun and a rifle. These two guns combined would actually lead to his falling out with Winchester, and so FN and Remington would get their crack at Browning's inventions. We saw the results of this in our Remington Model 8 video, which also features the FN 1900, so give that a look if you will. Now to summarize, Browning invents a gas-operated machine gun, then some short recoil pistols, then long recoil, long arms, shotgun and rifle. Basically, we're all over the place. Browning is playing inventor whack-a-mole. He's just hitting every beat as fast as he can to make sure that he doesn't miss anything. And that makes it pretty hard to talk about development, because in the same year as those long recoil guns are dropped, he pulls out this. Filed in 1900 and granted in 1901, thankfully this gun is not quite like ours today, but it does share a lot of its features, including but not limited to a rising locking block, a bolt assisting accelerator, a coil type recoil spring, a belt feed using a claw-like extractor, and a separate barrel extension. Overall, this is an extremely good start. While Browning did produce a working prototype, which actually likely preceded the patent, there are not many records of its firing, and it appears it did not see significant testing. However, Colt thought it had potential, and so signed a contract in 1903 for the production rights for the Browning recoil-operated machine gun, perhaps feeling they could sell it to the US government. But Ordnance went with the Maxim instead, the weirdest version they could, the US model 1904, which managed to weigh 62 pounds. That is until you added the 82-pound tripod, making it heavier than the original brass black powder model 1887. Yep, that's a heck of a choice, guys. This was, of course, under the auspices of Brigadier General William Crozier, Chief of Ordnance since 1901, and he had apparently decided against seriously testing the Browning gun. Hello, darkness, our old friend. Thankfully, John Browning wasn't quite done with his machine gun. He did, however, get distracted for a few years, probably busy inventing, every firearm ever. But by 1910, he was back at it, and he'd cleaned up the gun nicely. While I don't have any patent drawings, it's pretty safe to say this was extremely similar to the final product. From the example remaining at the John M. Browning Museum in Ogden, Utah, it appears all of the core concepts of the final 1917 are present, if ever so slightly different. He had made some significant improvements. 1, the hammer fire has been swapped for a striker. 2, a buffer segment with horn fiber discs was fitted at the rear. This both reduced recoil vibration and sped up the return of the bolt and therefore the fire rate. And finally, this gun was bottom ejecting. He had not liked the way his previous gun had ejected rounds out to the right of the gun, possibly disturbing other people in the firing line and sending up a shower of glittering brass for all to see. The world standard Maxim guns were tossing their brass out the front, but he reasoned this was also likely to catch some glint in the sun, or at least created more motion than absolutely necessary that could in theory be seen by an opponent on the battlefield. And so he had this gun poot them out the bottom. So what this means is that just about the whole 1917 machine gun was actually ready by 1910. Not really, because there's lots of little bugs to be chased out, I'm sure, but they are pretty dang close as was. That is really impressive. Now, obviously, the Ordnance Department was going to be absolutely excited about... No, they adopted the Ben Mercy. Yep, the Maxim 1904 was way too heavy, so this time they were going to go light, and while I commend the US Ordnance for being an early adopter of light machine guns, they did not really use them like we now think of as being ideal. Instead, the Ben Mercy was seen as an answer to the machine gun problem. Now, I want to be fair here. I've seen US Ordnance memos going all the way back to 1909 that predict the role of the machine gun in the Great War to at least 87% accuracy, which is high. I mean, they really foresaw the future in this one. Whole arguments were raged about how best to use a machine gun, and the Russo-Japanese War was often referenced. This 1904-1905 conflict had been a first for machine gun warfare and had proven the effectiveness of both the heavy machine gun and even the light. Those in Europe who paid attention really picked up on the roles played by the Maxim and Hotchkiss guns, but the US was uniquely curious about the light machine guns. That's because of several key factors particular to the United States at the time. First and foremost, at the turn of the century, the US was not one of the big great powers. Now, it wasn't this mass army that we think of. We think of Japan as being sort of this feudal system that rapidly modernizes, but the US had been experiencing something similar. It just was going from more rural agrarian to modernization, and it still wasn't like a major European power. And also it happened a little bit slower, and they stopped off to beat up Spain along the way. The US Army was still a frontier army. We still had huge swaths of untamed land. As far as borders go, well, we had Canada settled into being about the best neighbor you could ask for, and Mexico was almost no strategic threat. So no neighbors to fight, internal conflicts require packing ammo off-road for hundreds of miles, and any colonial activity is against peoples who barely have single-shot rifles. What little colonial activity there was at this point, which was still probably the most colonial activity. Don't worry about it. And in fact, the US Army was very small, and the US government didn't like spending a single penny when they didn't have to. Back then, the US Army back then. So no, light, fast, cheap, that's gonna win out in period US Ordnance mindset. So Browning saw the writing on the wall and decided to hold his cards until the proper moment came along, which was actually after war were declared. In Europe, not in the US yet. The Great War did suddenly have the US government thinking about maybe sort of spending a little money on getting their war face ready. Or not. While they hemmed and hawed, Browning quietly contacted Colt in 1915 and asked them if they wanted to get this shooty box all wrapped up again, just in case the government was found wanting. So Colt sent over their patent attorney Carl Ebbets, who would later sign an affidavit about his visit on August 30th of 1915, which actually helps us pin things down a bit in terms of dates. Carl tells us what would become the 1917 was largely done, and moreover that the gun was demonstrated on September 1st of 1915 right in front of the Chief of Ordnance. Yep, that guy. He saw the gun running, and then in November, he oversaw the adoption of the Vickers gun. Yep, the Vickers model 1915, which is a great gun, and they were in a hurry, so I can't really fault Crozier much here, although this is the first time he actually picked a good machine gun. Now, I want this to be a lesson to all of you about winning. It usually comes after a lot of losing. Browning is now 3 for 3 on losing to other designs, but that didn't stop the machine gun Moses. Instead, he and Colt kept working on the gun, which was smart because that Vickers order, it just kept not coming. So the Ordnance Machine Gun Board would be put to work investigating, and I frankly have a lot to say about that in the next episode, which is going to talk more about the sort of US politics and acquisition. For now, however, they were sticking with the Vickers, and Ordnance would not be scheduling any trials of any new designs until May of 1917. This decision was announced in October of 1916. Conveniently, the same month Ebbets would finally apply for patent protection on Browning's ideas. By this point, it was clear that the US was likely going to be pulled into the war, and so many patent applications around military technology were being delayed so as to prevent them from appearing in public records. We wouldn't want the enemy to read our notes, so this patent would be granted post-war. Okay, Browning's gun is ready. Not a single Vickers has actually been produced for the US yet. Just gotta hold out until May, and we'll be able to hopefully sell this thing. Okay, and once they started trying to organize the American Expeditionary Force, the US government realized they were well short of equipment, really short. More on that later. Artillery and machine guns were particularly scarce, and so US troops would find themselves using British and French equipment. Now those May trials were still held and resulted in 14 guns being tested, many of them familiar to us, like the Hotchkiss 1914 and the Hotchkiss Portative, the Lewis gun, plus some weird stuff like the Berthier, the Ravelli, and a tank version of the Marlin gun. In the end, 5 guns would see further testing. The Vickers, as we know, the Hotchkiss 1914, a gun we've also seen, and not one but 2 versions of that earlier Colt 1895 potato digger. One, a modernized export version known as the Model 1914, and the other a simplified version made by Marlin as the Model 1917. That latter one would end up being bought up for training. And of course the 5th was our Browning gun, finally getting the respect that it deserved and now included on the list. Although at this point it was just known as the water-cooled Colt automatic machine gun. Okay, it doesn't roll off the tongue. A battery of tests were performed on these guns. Let's pick a couple of these little tests and note some of the winners. Loading 1,000 cartridges into their necessary belts or clips, the Browning system was the fastest by a good bit. Loading and then firing 100 rounds. This was done with various wet and dry belts. The Vickers actually won this one, though the Browning was just behind it. Muzzle velocity was about the same across the board for all the guns, so no winner there. Endurance firing won another point for the Browning by far. In accuracy, the Vickers took the lead. Firing at extreme angles of elevation or depression, well, the Browning actually won this one, and the Vickers in particular struggled with its belt needing more guidance when pointed real high or real low. Dumping sand in the action favored the Browning. Feeding intentionally deformed and damaged cartridges, well, actually the Vickers and the Browning tied on this test. In analyzing parts in disassembly, the Browning was the winner, and the least headspace change after firing a total of 75,000 rounds each. Actually, the Marlin 1917 took the victory on this one. Now, the time it takes to replace critical parts in the field, that is a point for the Hotchkiss 1914. And finally, our Browning was also the best in class for weight. So there's a lot of points on the board for Colt's Browning gun, but it gets even better when you understand how much it swayed one way or the other. The sustained endurance fire test had actually been incredibly impressive. 20,000 rounds in the first test. 1 stoppage, fault of the ammo, 2 more stoppages, so 3 total. Those 2 occurred for undetermined reasons, not necessarily blamed on the gun. Each time, however, fire was resumed by simply pulling that charging handle back and squeezing the trigger again. A second 20,000 round endurance test was started, and I believe this was done on the same original gun. This time, 5 stoppages occurred, but all were blamed on improper loading of the belt, or the belt now being stretched or otherwise damaged from earlier tests. That is until around shot 39,500. Then they finally suffered a sear breakage, which was something that actually could be corrected at the manufacturing level. It could have been better heat treated. On disassembly and inspection, wear was absolutely minimal. So a third 20,000 round endurance test was done on the same prototype gun, and again, it passed with flying colors. These tests were so phenomenal that they did not stop there. A second prototype gun had to be brought in for fear that they had just somehow lucked out on the construction of the first, or otherwise given it so much attention that there was no way this could be done in serial production. This one was endurance tested as well and ran continuously for 48 minutes and 16 seconds. This astounded everyone. But wait, there is more. The Browning was simpler to produce at the manufacturing level. First, because Colt was already familiar with the gun, but also because each part had been carefully designed in order to use available tooling and simpler machine operations. President of the Machine Gun Board, Brigadier General Francis H. French, would refer to John Browning as the master machine gun mechanic of the world, and his board would recommend the immediate purchase of 10,000 Browning machine guns. That recommendation stuck, and so the US government would begin to focus exclusively on the Browning as its next official machine gun. But there would need to be some final tidying up. Sights, grips, the usual arguments on fitment. In the end, they went with a single-handed arrangement over the more prevalent two-handed spade grip configuration that we've seen. This was decided on for several reasons. Simpler to manufacture, the ability to add a shoulder stock if desired, the ability to use the offhand to adjust the tripod, being able to reach the gun at odd angles and tight spots, and because the 1917 was so mild on recoil, who really needed two hands? The rear sight was a flip-up ladder and very intricate in design, with a central adjustable aperture, well, set of apertures, and a notch. Because the AEF was currently using European maps and so far using European guns, well, best to leave it graduated in meters, 2,800 of them. If that seems a bit short, that's because that's what they could fit on that top cover. They'd take care of that in the next model. Now, that rear sight is going to have a unique role in our story besides all that next episode. The tripod situation was also finalized with a slightly modified and lightened version of Browning's own prototype being put into use as the model 1917 tripod. These weighed in at 50 pounds, same as the Vickers did. From our animation, we can see how to set the gross elevation, the fine elevation, and we can set the azimuth markings and adjust the azimuth itself. Interestingly, this would be superseded by the model 1918 tripod, which was apparently universally loathed for its complexity and cumbersomeness. Despite over 30,000 being made, the 1918 would be abandoned immediately. This gets weirder when you realize all the Browning 1917 ammunition boxes were notched at the lower corner for the 1918 tripod that they were never issued on. And finally, yes, as a jacketed machine gun, this did come with a condenser can which collected water to later be dumped back into the system. Okay, the gun is finally adopted, so now we can take a closer look at it, which I did do a few years ago, so let's do some fancy editing and script work. Once more, obviously not ideal sound conditions, so I'm going to shut up and just dub this later for you guys. So let's watch me mime. So we have our jacketed machine gun with a single pistol style grip and low slung trigger. At the rear, we have a simple two-position safety, which blocks the trigger from rising. If we pull our latch back, we can open the action. Here we have the lever-actuated feed system, which pulls in our belt, and is guided by a channel in the top of the breech block. This is our rear sight, which is probably a bit hard to see, but while we're here, this is the windage knob, large and obvious. Elevation is grossly adjustable with the push button, or finely adjustable with a knob at the top. You can rotate this plate for your pick of various apertures or a notch. Alright, let me flip this over. It's like a wing check. Now we have our charging handle. Which drives our breech block and the extractor claw for feeding ammo. At the front, we have a full water jacket and steam fittings. Now let's tear this thing down. We'll start at the rear, opening up the main cover. Note, we cannot release the latch forward until we do what is the only fiddly bit on the gun. Withdraw the breech block and hold it in place. Use the rim of a cartridge or a screwdriver to depress and turn the small, cylindrical extension at the rear. This is the driving spring rod. Spin it 1/4 turn until vertical. If successful, your outie becomes an innie. Now we can pull the charging handle forward pull the latch forward and lift out the back plate. Withdrawing the bolt, we can now pull it from the breech block and the breech block from the receiver. Pop the extractor off that breech block, and the rest of this can remain in place. Oh, here's our locking surface, by the way. Now we can depress the trigger pin from the right side of the frame. This could be done with the tip of a cartridge. I have a punch. Just push it in and withdraw the barrel to action. This includes the lock frame, barrel extension, and barrel. To free the lock frame, we'll flip the accelerator. Now we can see the locking block, which rises and falls to lock and unlock the breech. If I reinsert the breech block, we can see it in action. Up is locked, down is unlocked. I'm going to skip any further breakdown of the sub-assemblies and head for the top cover, which comes off with a drift pin. The latch, well, I actually could have removed that ages ago, but here. Now, just to be clear, you can disassemble a lot further than that. That's mostly what I would do for field work, but that is the most of it. I will say, however, I did neglect to show you all that you could just simply spin that barrel off from the extension had you wanted to. It's super easy and convenient. Now, if this left you wanting more, have no fear, because we can see every bit and boodle inside that gun in operation in an animation that we have been able to get from Vbbsmyt.
Starting off, this is a water-cooled system. But we've seen that before, so let's get into the action. Simplifying things, we have a barrel, barrel extension, and the locking block, in green, inside. When the barrel recoils, it allows the green block to fall. When it is returned forward, the block rises. Behind the barrel extension is the lock frame assembly, which houses the accelerator, a set of steel fingers that rock back and forth with the barrel extension. Combined with recoil force, it helps throw the breech block rearward at the moment the action unlocks and locks the barrel open. The breech block is returned forward by the driving spring, in red, up top. Looking at it from the side, we can see things more clearly. Note the green locking block being cammed up and down as it's driven forward and back. And now we can see the dual purpose of the accelerator. First, helping to impart more force to the breech block when unlocked, and once turned over, it prevents the barrel extension from returning forward until the breech block returns to lock. Cutting the breech block in half, we can see the striker, in red, being driven forward by its own spring into the primer of the next cartridge whenever released by the sear, in purple. The striker is reset on recoil by the overhead cocking lever. The sear is sprung by a flat spring to remain upwards, but if the trigger is depressed and the breech block is in its forward position, the sear will be cammed down, again releasing the striker. The trigger bar is also sloped in order to drive the sear upwards, guaranteeing it returns to its upper position and snags the firing pin. At the very rear, we can see the buffer system, similar to the BAR. This actually borrows from the Auto 5 shotgun, in that it both cushions and expands to further add friction. Behind the spring is a stack of cushioned washers made from horn fiber, interestingly, similar to the buffer disc on a Winchester 1911. The feed system somewhat resembles the Maxim, though the guide track is milled into the top of the breech block, tipping the belt feed lever, which drives the belt feed slide left and right. Inside the belt feed slide is the belt feed pawl, which is sprung downwards and toothed in one direction, causing it to skip over rounds as it travels left and drag them in when traveling right. The flat spring in red keeps the extractor pressed firmly over the rim of the next cartridge. An extension at the base of the extractor serves as an ejector, shoving the previous, now spent case out the bottom of the receiver. From this angle, we can also see the extractor assembly, which lowers when retracted and is cammed upwards when the action returns forward. This motion causes it to withdraw a cartridge from the belt and lower it to the breech face. The extractor cam plunger is sprung, so that it's retracted during rearward motion and pops free to guide the extractor upwards on forward motion. And that is our gun, piece by piece, round by round.
All right, we have this gun adopted. We just need to make a couple tens of thousands of them. No big deal. Let's look at Colt's pickle so far. They're in the hook for 4,000 Vickers, which they have not been very quick on at all. They agreed to the initial 10,000 Browning 1917s, and if you've watched our other episode, you know they promised up to 12,000 Browning automatic rifles, model of 1918. These were, of course, the walking fire-ready man-portable machine gun rifle things. Then there's the Colt 1895-14 potato digger. Over 15,000 of these were purchased during the war, though only fewer than 2,500 were likely still going to be made at this point. Now, just add in production of pistols and revolvers and all the market competition for men and resources. Okay, Colts, they're going to have to let other manufacturers produce this gun. They'll just have to name some ludicrous licensing fee, and no. The US government was having none of it this time. Patience had finally worn out. Then Lieutenant Colonel John H. Rice wrote to the Chief of Ordnance in August of 1917, voicing that Colt had missed multiple opportunities to keep up production and were largely mishandling their war effort. He believed allowing them any control in the distribution of manufacture of the Browning machine guns would be a huge mistake. Ordnance actually listened. They would only formalize the contract with Colt if Colt released the rights to produce the Browning 1917 to other companies during wartime. Colt would yield, and so we'll see two other factories get involved. Now, for their generous licensing, Colt was awarded a one-time reward of $1 million, a kind thank you for their solidarity in the war effort. The accompanying letter also made a postscript apology that it was a lesser amount than that negotiated from Colt's original request. Never change, Colt. Never change. Now, Colt would begin setting up a new plant in Meriden, Connecticut, but of course that would take time to get running, and they were now responsible for producing the necessary machine drawings and helping set up tooling for the other two manufacturers, the first of which would be Remington, who received their contract in September of 1917, requesting 15,000 model 1917 machine guns. And Remington would be up and running by May of 1918, production taking a bit of retooling because Remington had been busy producing the Mosin 1891 for Russia. And as we saw in our episode on that rifle, another American business would also be producing the Mosin for Russia, New England Westinghouse. They too would tackle the 1917, beginning work in January of 1918 with a contract to produce some 20,000 guns. Within 29 days, they had their first prototype ready, handmade of course. But within 63 days, the first whole gun came off the assembly line. The plant would wind up producing 500 a day by the end of the war. That is frankly incredible. Good job, Westinghouse. Now, the US kept stacking orders as things went, but that largely didn't matter. Colt production would start in June, and to be fair to them, this time they'd built a new facility and had to help the others get to work. While all this is going on, our man John Moses Browning did not sit idle. He got in there and he helped to arrange the manufacture at various plants, coordinating between them. And it was a big project, complete interchangeability of parts through a myriad of workers. He and his team constantly swapped manufacturers' components to make certain, and every 500th gun was tested with 20,000 rounds. Well, when possible. His work was so important, he was offered an Army commission at the rank of colonel, but he declined. Now, all this production was done in a mad rush to fully equip the US Expeditionary Force and even some allies for the expected 1919 all-out head-to-head spring invasions. As we know in hindsight, the vast majority of this effort was unnecessary because the war would actually halt unexpectedly in an armistice in November of 1918. So what was the total score for manufacture? Westinghouse managed 30,000 and some change, Remington 12,000, Colt 600. However, the lines were not immediately idled because the armistice did not immediately end the war and because the US feared a collapse of the arms industry. So in the end, we see these numbers keep rising for a short while post-war until Westinghouse rounds out near 48,000, Remington just under 20,000, and Colt 2,500 or so. Cost-wise, the Browning would also end up being a savings. The French Hotchkiss 1914 ran the US government $528, a Vickers $490, the Brownings were only $238, and we'll see some more reason for that cost savings in our next episode. But for now, unfortunately, I am a finite being, and so I've been forced to break up this conversation into two parts. You saw the gun pulled apart, you saw the fancy 3D animation, you got to hear the mechanical history. But next time, we'll get Mae to shoot the thing, and we'll talk about shooting the thing, and we'll talk about what it was like for the soldiers to have this thing. And I'll explore a lot more about the US machine guns in World War I as a whole concept, which was an all-out mess. All right, have a good one, guys. Alright gang, just a brief announcement this time. Number one, if you'd like to know more about what's going on behind the scenes, check in at Patreon or Subscribestar, where our supporters get a behind the scenes podcasty thing every other week to go with the show. In addition to that, I would like to remind people that I do have a sort of prototype website in the works that's surplus.com. There is no C&Rsenal branding there because this is sort of my gift to the collector and historical gun community. It's a place where you can stick articles or read articles that other people have put together, or you can see videos that have to do with these sort of things aggregated into one place just in case YouTube ever decides to ditch somebody's channel, or maybe there's a reloading video that can't be hosted on YouTube, so it's hosted on BitChute, so we can change the link at Surplus. You get the idea. If you'd like to go over there, there are some great articles that have been written by individuals who have decided to submit their own material to the site. So you'll see things about like the Winchester 1897 shotgun, or my favorite right now is probably 2 out of 3 parts of a history of the Spencer shotgun that have been written out in extreme detail that I have not even seen in a book to date. So there's a lot of things to find on there. Alright guys, stop on by, but otherwise have a good one.